Alrighty, guys, we're going to get started on the era of Thomas Jefferson. I hope you guys learning about the French Revolution in Napoleonic France. Normally, I'd spend a whole week on that, but because of our circumstances here, we're moving on to the era of Thomas Jefferson. So, let's start about when he was elected. This is really a fascinating election for multiple reasons. One, it's basically a revenge of the previous election because Thomas Jefferson faced John Adams for presidency number two, and Adams won, and Jefferson became the vice president. And another controversy happens. Now, Jefferson will ultimately win the election, but there was a bit of a problem with how he won it. Pretty much, Jefferson made it clear that I am not going to have John Adams as my vice president. Don't like the guy. He smells, or something like that. And he chose a running mate, Aaron Burr. And when people were voting on the ballot, they voted for both Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And that got to a little bit of a glitch in our electoral college system because it made it look like as if Burr and Jefferson both got 73 electoral votes and Adams at 65. So it was like, who do we give the presidency to then? They both have 73 votes. Or do we choose one of them and then John Adams becomes the vice president? So Congress had to fix this situation, and they passed an amendment to make sure this never ever happens again, the 12th Amendment, which pretty much, long story short, when the president runs and they're ultimately elected as president of the United States, they choose their vice president on the running ticket. No more the loser becomes vice president nonsense. And then Jefferson would be inaugurated. He actually was the first president ever to be inaugurated in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Another fun fact, instead of taking a fancy carriage there, he actually walked to his inauguration. Could you imagine what that's like if the president just literally walked to his inauguration? That's kind of crazy, but our government was a lot more humble back then. Now, these are the notes for this part of the PowerPoint. I gave you guys a whole bunch of fill in the blanks on RenWeb under Documents. Make sure you're filling in those blanks. Just feel free to pause the video whenever you reach that, and then I'll move on, which I'm doing now. Now, the Supreme Court had something really interesting happen at the beginning of Jefferson's presidency. A court case known as Marbury v. Madison happened. The outcome of this court case would forever change the Supreme Court forever because it would establish something known as judicial review. Now, judicial review, if you remember it from last year, is the Supreme Court's ability to take any law that goes against the Constitution and just say, nope, it's gone. Even if the legislative branch makes the law, and even if the president signs the law, it don't matter. If it goes against the Constitution, this judicial branch, specifically the Supreme Court, says it's out of here. But does anybody remember where judicial review actually is in the Constitution? And if this looks familiar from last year, it should, because it's not found in the Constitution. It's as if it was an error or there was something missing. Well, that was because of this court case here, Marbury v. Madison. Long story short, because we did learn this last year, and if you have the PowerPoints to help you go along it, but there was a situation where, long story short, a guy named William Marbury was appointed as a justice of peace in one of the federal courts of D.C., which is something the president can do. They can appoint judges to certain positions, but he was appointed by Adams's presidency, and it was near the end of Adams's presidency. Long story short, when he was walking out the door and he was about to no longer be president, he decided to appoint 58 new judges in order to make sure his Federalists still had more say in the courts. And again, the president has the power to do this. He chooses the judge, the Senate confirms them, and then at that point, the Secretary of State is the one who tells them that, yay, you got the job. Two of those three things happen. The Secretary of State not delivering the commission is the thing that didn't happen, and thusly Marbury didn't receive his commission to get his job. The reason why is because time was simply running out. John Adams literally was appointing 50 plus judges on March 3rd. Jefferson's inauguration was March 4th. It's impossible with that day's technology to try to get all these things delivered in time. And Marbury was one that was not delivered. Once Jefferson was sworn in as president, he said, no, I don't want Marbury to be a judge. I want to pick my own judges because I'm a Democratic Republican and I don't want Federalist judges. So William Marbury does the any logical thing to do. He sues the federal government, says that I should have that job. I don't have that job right now, so I will sue. So that at least explains the Marbury part in Marbury v. Madison. And how does James Madison get into this? Well, he was the Secretary of State under Adams as well as Jefferson. So he was the one who ultimately should have delivered these things. Long story short, though, he sues. Who takes the case? It ultimately fell on the Supreme Court to take this case because of something known as jurisdiction. Just like if you commit a crime in Detroit, you'll be tried in Detroit even though you live in West Palm. However, there was a problem with this because the Constitution stated that the Supreme Court can only have appellate jurisdiction, meaning that it can only deal with appeals. It can't ever deal with a case when it first starts. And on the flip side, it now has this case here. Who wins this case? Technically nobody. The Supreme Court, though, was the big winner because they ruled that a law that was passed in 1789, known as the Judiciary Act, which told them that this case should be here, they declared it unconstitutional, and they established the precedent of judicial review. Now, why is that significant? Well, if you remember from last year with precedent, when a court rules on a decision, it could directly impact future decisions. And in this case, it definitely has. So Marbury v. Madison establishes judicial review, which again, that's the ability of the Supreme Court to say that's not constitutional, so it needs to go away. This is something that could have been very useful during the Alien and Sedition Acts. There's your notes for Marbury v. Madison. Now, during Jefferson's presidency, the Louisiana Purchase was also a thing. Now, for a long time, Spain was in control of the Mississippi. As you remember when we were talking about Washington's presidency and some of the problems he had to face, Spain said you can't go through New Orleans, and that was how they got to the Mississippi. And for years after that, America shipped things peacefully through New Orleans. And then suddenly Jefferson had found out that Spain had given, quotes on given because Spain was forced, to give New Orleans as well as the rest of its Louisiana territory to France. Now, this was shocking to Jefferson because he already knew, and you guys know based upon Napoleon, that Napoleon had already had his eyes to conquer all of Europe. Maybe he had his eyes also to conquer North America as well. Speaking of which, what was up with that Napoleon guy? Well, if you remember, France was at war with pretty much every single country in Europe, and Napoleon rises to power and defeats basically all of them. He beats Spain, Italy, Prussia, the Russians, all that different stuff. More like conquered them. But you kind of get the idea. So when he conquered Spain, Spain gave Louisiana to France. So this big chunk on the map here, which used to have a Spanish flag, now has a French flag. So at this point, Jefferson had to think of a solution here because he needed to get access to that Mississippi River for trade purposes. So he decided to send out a guy named James Monroe, which, if you know the fifth president, you know his future one day, to try to buy just the city of New Orleans. If you have the city of New Orleans, then you can have access to the Mississippi River as well as New Orleans and gumbo and all the nice things in New Orleans. So he sent James Madison simply to buy the city. But suddenly opportunity seemed to have struck. Monroe found out when he was in France that France had lost Haiti to a revolution. And in France's eyes, the only reason they wanted Louisiana was to grow crops in order to feed Haiti. Haiti was the crown jewel of the empire of France in the Caribbean. It was making the most money. And now that that was lost to the Haitian Revolution, it was like, they don't need Louisiana. Also, war with Britain was coming once again for France. And this happened about 7 times during the Napoleonic era. So Napoleon needed some money in order to buy cannons, horses, to pay soldiers, buy guns for his Grande Armée. And as a result of this kind of changed the dynamics of the bargaining table. Napoleon wasn't interested in just selling New Orleans. He was interested in selling the entire Louisiana territory. Now, when Napoleon decided to invade Switzerland at that point, the Napoleonic Wars had begun, and Britain will declare war on France again, and Napoleon's going to need some extra funds. So he decides to put Louisiana on the market. And if you remember anything from those videos I sent you guys, you're going to see that quite often. Now, this is where the Louisiana Purchase happens. Thomas Jefferson agrees with Napoleon to buy Louisiana in its entirety. For $15 million, the U.S. nearly doubles its size at about 4 cents an acre. Got to put it in perspective, your guys' house is probably on a quarter or a tenth of an acre, and Jefferson got an acre for every 4 cents he spent. And that nearly doubles the United States' size. As you can kind of see with the map, it's also going to lead to some exploration. There are your notes on the Louisiana Purchase. Now, once Jefferson had bought Louisiana, it was time to actually explore what he had bought. So he will now send a couple of famous explorers out to explore the Western territories and chart them. He sends a guy named Meriwether Lewis and Clark. Their orders were very simple: record the geography, plants, animals, and other natural features of the region. You got Meriwether Lewis, who was an explorer, soldier, politician, and public administrator. He won't live much longer past this journey because he will be either murdered or commit suicide in 1809. Now, William Clark, on the other hand, he'll eventually be in charge of the Missouri Territory and head Indian affairs, so a little bit more success for him. Other goals of this expedition was to make contact with the Native Americans who had lived in the Louisiana Territory and basically size them up, see what the U.S. is dealing with as far as Native Americans in this area. It should be noted, though, that these guys are pioneers. Similar to how the first astronauts were landing on the moon, they were experiencing something that no one had done before. Lewis and Clark did essentially the same. Instead of the astronauts like Neil Armstrong being on the moon, these guys are going out to territory that has never been explored. Now, granted, the Native Americans had been there for years, but no Americans were there. That being said, they were going to need some help doing this. And that's, if you've ever heard of her name before, is where Sacagawea comes in. Sacagawea would serve as the translator for Lewis and Clark. She was from the Shoshone tribe, and she was actually the wife of a French-Canadian trader in the region, which was very fortunate for Lewis and Clark. There are your notes for Lewis and Clark. Now, during that journey, they'll have to do some pretty impressive feats like cross the Rocky Mountains, which are huge if you've ever looked at the map. But once they were atop the Rockies, they had seen the view of the West, only to be disappointed that there were still more mountains to cross. Once they had reached the Pacific in 1805, they had finally reached the Pacific Ocean, being the first Americans to do so. And then they would start working their way back to make it back to St. Louis, where the whole journey had begun. Their journey would bring great awareness of the region, about some of the most beautiful parts of our nation, as well as an interest of people of saying like, hey, if I got nothing good going on here in Boston, Massachusetts, why not roll the dice and go to territory that nobody else lives in, and according to Lewis and Clark, it is actually quite remarkable. There are your final notes for today on Lewis and Clark as well as Jeffersonian America. Now, on Monday, we'll continue on this, and then we'll have an assignment. Be on the lookout for that.